It has been said time and time again, but The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is one of the greatest video games ever released. Regardless of whether or not you agree with that statement, it's undeniable that it is one of the most popular and influential games released in the last 25 years. The grand scale of the adventure and the story's cinematic nature contribute to its indelible legacy, but as with most Zelda games, the impressive dungeons are where the game truly shines. From the Great Deku Tree all the way to Ganon's castle, Ocarina of Time's dungeons deliver an engaging and memorable experience that is fun to go back to year after year. For the purposes of this video, I won't be including areas I consider to be mini-dungeons such as the Ice Cavern, Bottom of the Well, or Gerudo Training Grounds, and instead we'll look at the dungeons that net you either a Spiritual Stone or Sage Medallion, as well as Ganon's Castle. With that being said, welcome everyone to every Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time dungeon ranked. One of the chief reasons the dungeons in Ocarina of Time are so memorable is because they all manage to create immersive and unique atmospheres that draw the player in. Whether it's the ambiance of the Great Deku Tree or the chilling, haunted sounds of the Shadow Temple, each dungeon has an aura about it that makes it feel like Link has been transported to a new world. With the child dungeons in particular, Link must actually enter structures or creatures found in the real world, unlike the temples adult Link is tasked with exploring. This winds up creating some of the most novel locations for a dungeon in the Zelda franchise, with Lord Jabu Jabu's belly being near the top of the list. What I love about Jabu Jabu's belly is all of the little details that really make you feel like you're exploring a living, breathing creature. From the way the walls of his belly spit out a substance when you hit it with an item, to the way the rooms will move in line with Jabu Jabu's breathing, it truly captures the feeling of being inside an organism that's still alive. Specifically, the opening room where you can not only see Jabu Jabu's teeth, but you also shoot what I've always assumed was a tonsil of some kind to solve the dungeon's first puzzle, drives that feeling home for me. And the inclusion of electrically charged tentacles and hostile bubbles to counteract the infestation of enemies always felt like a nice touch to show the body's self-defense mechanisms at work. However, ultimately where I lose my positive feelings with this third child dungeon is when examining the layout and puzzles of the dungeon. I find Lord Jabu Jabu's belly to be a little too simple for Child Link's third trial and feel it is a step down from Dodongo's cavern that came before it. My main issue stems from the fact that you must battle the same tentacle monster almost 3 times in a row in order to unlock areas needed to progress through the dungeon. Each fight is essentially identical to the one that came before it, and because the fights are so close to the rooms they unlock, it requires little mental energy to figure out where to go next. Rather than spreading the tentacle monsters throughout the dungeon and requiring the player to use their spatial awareness to remember which room was just unlocked, the core of Jabu Jabu's gameplay becomes crisscrossing a single 3-pronged hallway to repeatedly challenge the same foe. Thankfully, once all the tentacle monsters are defeated, we are treated to arguably the best and certainly most shocking mini-boss in all of Ocarina of Time. The big Octo fight is thrilling, intense, and unexpected, making it stand out as a great example of how Ocarina of Time can mix things up at a moment's notice. We are then treated to one of the dungeon's only switch puzzles that requires the boomerang, something I wish we could have seen more considering how early you get the boomerang before reaching the boss room. Baronade, the boss of the inside of Jabu Jabu's belly, is fairly reflective of the mundanity of the dungeon itself. Despite being thematically interesting and appropriate, Baronade has a fairly boring fight that sees Link spend most of his time in battle Z-targeting as he waits for an opening to appear. Once that moment comes, launching the boomerang is quite easy, as is the follow-up damage you get after stunning the creature, leading to one of the more forgettable bosses in Ocarina of Time. In the end, regardless of praiseworthy details such as the gross pulsating noises that help to build the atmosphere of the dungeon, or the utilization of Princess Ruto to solve puzzles, Jabu Jabu's belly falls a little flat. I haven't even mentioned the frustrating process of getting back to the main room if you accidentally fall down one of its many open holes, or how annoying it is if Princess Ruto becomes out of reach or falls in the water. These scenarios don't help Jabu Jabu's case and reinforce why I've placed this dungeon at the bottom of the list. Still, I wouldn't describe the inside of Jabu Jabu's belly as bad, but rather disappointing, as I could see this dungeon being one of my favorites with a few tweaks and additions. Unfortunately, without any changes, it stands as my pick for the weakest of the 3 child dungeons, as well as my least favorite in Ocarina of Time. As controversial as it may be to not rank the Water Temple as the worst of Ocarina of Time's dungeons, I certainly still think this part of the game has some major flaws. Of course, there is the infamous complaint of having to take the Iron Boots on and off again, constantly forcing you into your menu and disrupting the flow of gameplay. That is the largest and most clear mistake the Water Temple makes. Then I must acknowledge and agree with another popular complaint, which is that the Dark Link fight, for as cool and special as it is borderline impossible to beat without cheesing the fight. And lastly, I will also jump on the bandwagon in saying that the level of backtracking found here can get a bit ridiculous, especially if you, like me, did not notice the Song of Time stone behind the Longshot chest the first time through. These problems are well known and have been talked about to death, and are unfortunately at the core of why the Water Temple ranks so low for me. Still, with each additional time I play through the Water Temple, I actually grow to appreciate it more and more, to the point that I seriously considered ranking it a little higher on this list initially. I think if Ocarina of Time 3D has shown us anything, it is that this temple is just a few tweaks away from being one of the most legendary dungeons in Zelda history, rather than one of the most infamous. By simply turning the Iron Boots into an equipable C item, the flow of gameplay is able to be maintained throughout the temple, and the puzzles surrounding the boots become less tedious. And while I might not fully agree with the idea of putting colored pathways to the 3 water level changing stations, I will admit it can help cut down on the amount of unnecessary backtracking that can make this dungeon so frustrating at times. But I think the reason I can't fully get behind an idea like that is because the Water Temple actually feels like a challenge, whereas most other dungeons do not. Whereas most of the dungeons in Ocarina of Time feel like a series of one-off puzzles, the Water Temple feels like one giant puzzle that you're playing through from start to finish. It's incredibly rewarding when you are able to recall that bombable wall that you pass on your way up to the first water level changing station at a time where you need a key. It's satisfying to trek back to the fast dropping gate on the second floor, knowing you can now make it through in time with the addition of the Longshot. And because of its difficulty, it has a level of gratification that comes from solving puzzles that other temples can't match. But be that as it may, the Water Temple still has other aspects that prevent it from being ranked any higher. For starters, Morpha is far and away the easiest and least memorable of the 9 dungeon bosses in Ocarina of Time. Even without the knowledge that you can repeatedly long-shot the membrane in the corner for an easy win, Morpha remains one of the least threatening main dungeon bosses in all of Zelda. Not only is Morpha not a scary or intimidating creature in the slightest, its attacks are incredibly slow and easy to dodge. If they do manage to hit, they surprisingly deal a decent amount of damage, but chances are you won't be hit unless you want to be. And to make matters worse, the room leading into the Morpha fight feels like a more difficult task to get by than the boss of the dungeon itself. I also feel the Water Temple is among the least atmospheric of the main dungeons in the game. Coming from the mysterious and enchanting Ice Cavern, which, for all its flaws, nails its theme to perfection, the Water Temple can only be looked at as disappointing. While I will admit it has a tranquil yet mystifying theme that I really enjoy, other dungeons simply do a better job at immersing me. And obviously there are plenty of water-themed enemies and puzzles which I appreciate, so I guess this is more of a personal preference than a true criticism. Nonetheless, it contributes to why I have the Water Temple ranked so low, and a factor as to why it's my least favorite adult dungeon to replay. I think the role of any second dungeon in The Legend of Zelda is to amp up the size and scope of what a Zelda dungeon in that game can be by expanding on the elements established in the first dungeon. It's important not only for the general progression of the game, but to keep the player from finding the dungeons uninteresting or boring. The second trial needs to take place in a larger, more expansive area for exploration, have more complex puzzles to solve, and introduce new elements of gameplay to keep the player engaged. Luckily for Ocarina of Time, Dodongo's Cavern accomplishes everything that a second dungeon should, creating an unforgettable trial along the way. My favorite aspect of Dodongo's Cavern is how it debuts so many enemies that you likely haven't seen before. Front and center is the intimidating Beamos that will zap you with its laser if you get too close to it, which is situated on the middle platform of the main room. Then you have the Dodongos, for which the cavern is named after, that roam certain hallways and try to breathe fire on you. Additionally, you have common enemies like Keese and their fire variant, which can burn your Deku shield to ashes. And for the first time in the game, we get a true mini-boss as we duel with several Lizalfos throughout the dungeon. These new foes, combined with hazards like the blade traps and lava that coat the floor of several rooms throughout the dungeon, make Dodongo's Cavern a much more volatile place to navigate through compared to the Great Deku Tree. Not to mention that the boss of Dodongo's Cavern, King Dodongo, is several times more intimidating and dangerous than the Deku Tree's Queen Gohma. Aside from being absolutely gargantuan and intimidating, his Fire Breath has a huge range that can easily kill Link this early into the game, which makes for a much tougher boss battle. All these elements add to Dodongo's Cavern's increased difficulty, which helps you feel stronger and more accomplished after you've obtained the Goron Ruby. However, despite enjoying the heavier focus on combat, Dodongo's Cavern may be my least favorite setting in Ocarina of Time. While I think the giant Dodongo head is a nice detail that looms overhead as you weave in and out of the main room, the design of the cavern feels the most bland and generic of the 9 main dungeons. Thankfully, the game compensates by including a few more cinematic cutscenes to try and add some flair to Dodongo's Cavern, but ultimately they don't add much. In general, I think the darker tones of Ocarina of Time's dungeons serve them well, but Dodongo's Cavern is one of the few that I feel benefit greatly from the brighter lighting and refined textures of the 3DS remake. Not that aesthetics are everything, as certainly the Second Child dungeon impresses in other ways, but it's tough to ignore between the Great Deku Tree and Jabu Jabu's belly. Finally, I want to talk about something that bothers me, and that is the sign that explains the puzzle of dropping bombs in the giant Dodongo's eyes. It's been discussed before, but I agree with the sentiment that this ruins a large part of the dungeon for me. You are shown how bombs are useful, as they are not only how you get into the dungeon itself, but you are constantly using them within the dungeon to progress. By the time you've reached the point that the giant Dodongo's eyes need to be bombed, the level has programmed it into your mind that bombs are the solution to whatever problem you may have, be it an enemy or a wall that's in your way, that even if it wasn't obvious to drop bombs from the bridge, I'd venture most people would come to that solution on their own. It feels like a major letdown to have the entire first part of the dungeon revolve around getting to solve this puzzle, but then the answer is given to you directly before you get to figure it out for yourself. To some it may not be a big deal, and honestly it wasn't something I thought about very hard in the past, but when analyzing Dodongo's Cavern for this video, it stuck out like a sore thumb, and is part of why I've decided to rank it a little lower than I might have initially. As far as first dungeons go in the Legend of Zelda franchise, I don't think there is a better opener than the Great Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time. For a game as adventurous and grand as this one is, the Great Deku Tree does a phenomenal job of establishing not only the new 3D environment Ocarina of Time brought to the Zelda franchise, but the stakes and drama of this new adventure in Hyrule. It sets the tone for the rest of the game and gives you a taste of what's in store for you in the future trials. And as the first dungeon in Ocarina of Time, it knows its role and serves its purpose well to produce one of the most memorable and significant dungeons in all of Zelda. First impressions are everything, and in that regard, the Great Deku Tree delivers by providing a complete yet simple introduction into so many of the gameplay elements Ocarina of Time has to offer. By the time you finish this dungeon, you will be fully versed in how to aim with items in a 3D space, whether to kill an enemy out of reach, activate a switch located on a wall, or find a hidden secret that helps you progress. You'll understand that you can dive beneath the water, and in certain instances it will be necessary to solve puzzles or find collectibles. You'll discover how to effectively Z-target as well as use your shield to reflect projectiles. The importance of using your Deku Stick as a torch and pushing blocks into the right location get established, and the motif of using the dungeon item to defeat the boss of the dungeon begins here as well. The Great Deku Tree is also complemented by an ambient and sacred atmosphere that immediately envelops the player upon entering the dungeon. From the opening pan, which demonstrates just how tall and deep the structure is, you get the impression that you are taking on a very important task. The earthy textures, Skulltulas, and various Deku creatures all enhance the feeling of being in a massive tree, which adds to the feeling of adventure as you explore the various rooms and floors of the dungeon. Set pieces like jumping off the top floor in the opening room to crash through the webbing are as exciting as they are dangerous, and help to tie into the theme of courage that pervades Link throughout his journey. And the ominous feeling of sinking lower and lower into this infested and cursed area only further contributes to the amazing atmosphere the Great Deku Tree produces. As often is the case with first levels in video games, there is nothing particularly egregious here that I can complain about. Sure, the dungeon is about as easy as a Zelda dungeon gets, but that's what I expect for a trial like this being reached so early into the game. In that aspect, the Great Deku Tree actually does a brilliant job of consistently rewarding the player as they progress through the dungeon, whether through items like the map and slingshot, or by showing them new ways to interact with their environment. Unfortunately, this also means that by keeping things simple and easy, the potential for the dungeon can only go so high. There are virtually no engaging battles to be had here, no complex or interesting puzzles to overcome, and the Great Deku Tree is the shortest dungeon in the game by far. Even so, for as short an experience as it is, there is no denying that the Great Deku Tree is the perfect start for a game as legendary as Ocarina of Time. It seamlessly blends the lighthearted adventure feel from the game's intro sequence into a more serious tone that will be more appropriate for the rest of the adventure. It establishes through its gameplay and post-dungeon cutscene that this will be an epic adventure that will impact all the lives in the land of Hyrule. And it manages to mentally engage the player without frustrating them, making it a perfect lure to get players to want to explore more of the game after the dungeon is complete. If not for Ocarina of Time's excellent adult temples, the Great Deku Tree could go higher for me, but as it stands, it is my pick for the best child dungeon in the game, and one of my favorite intro dungeons in all of Zelda. As important as the beginning of a game is, equally or arguably more important is the game's finale. Ganon's Castle, despite not having a compass or a map, couldn't be a better example of how to execute a final dungeon and caps Ocarina of Time off in the most perfect of ways. Unlike each of the temples that precede it, Ganon's Castle is not interested in testing you in just one aspect of gameplay, but in all the skills you've acquired along your journey. The first half reflects that clearly, as you must revisit the challenges of each temple you've conquered, plus an additional trial for the Light Medallion. It's a simple yet extremely effective way to tie a bow on all the puzzles and obstacles you've encountered over your adventure. What I love about the Sage Trials is how you are not only tasked with some of the more challenging gameplay found in the entire title, but you are treated to a look back at all of the places you've been throughout your adventure. It's a reminder of all the hardships you've been through, and conquering them all again gives you confidence and the reassurance that you are in fact ready for this final fight with Ganondorf. Unlocking the gold gauntlets is a nice surprise along the way that only helps to make Link feel more powerful, and getting the double defense upgrade from the Great Fairy afterwards wholly reinforces that feeling. But if you still didn't feel capable enough, wiping the floor with Stalfos and Iron Knuckles in Ganon's Tower should help encourage you as you make your way into your showdown with Ganondorf. Perhaps my only qualm with the inside of Ganon's castle is the fact that it is really more of a gauntlet than a true dungeon. There is very little to think about in regards to dungeon layout, with only two straightforward keys in the Trial of Light that are both found in the same room as the door they unlock. Afterwards, in Ganon's Tower, even less thought is required as you are simply defeating enemies as you make your way from one floor to the next. Even the fight with Ganondorf requires little mental energy to complete, as you've essentially already experienced this battle with Phantom Ganon in the Forest Temple. In this way, I could understand why some might not even include Ganon's Castle in discussions about the game's dungeons, but I think there's still enough there to qualify it. Instead, Ganon's Castle, and specifically Ganon's Tower, focuses more on being cinematic than anything else. For me, it's what truly makes this final dungeon as iconic as it is, and without it, it could not rank as high as I have it. There are so many moments to speak of, but it starts with the sages creating the Rainbow Bridge to even get into the castle in the first place. As a kid, that was one of the most satisfying cutscenes because it meant access to this place that had been tauntingly close, yet out of reach for a majority of the game. Then later on, as Ganondorf's organ gets louder and louder, you enter a room to see a black and a white Iron Knuckle guarding a locked door, presenting arguably the most difficult non-boss fight in the game. Next, you come face to face with Ganondorf himself in the most iconic cutscene, maybe in all of Zelda history, as he demands the Triforce parts from Link and Zelda. Obviously, you then have the entire tower crumble sequence, and finally the epic final showdown with Ganon where you deliver the final blow with the Master Sword. It's hard to deny so many incredible sequences one right after another. While cinematics don't necessarily make a great dungeon themselves, they can certainly contribute to their lasting impact and memorability. Imagine the initial Ganondorf fight without the preceding cutscene or drawn-out build-up. It would have been pretty mediocre and probably lambasted for being a disappointment. Maybe the second fight would have fared better, but the drama of having the Master Sword knocked away and Zelda's involvement are what turn it from a great boss into a legendary one. Similarly, moments earlier on like the barrier being dispelled are what help give weight to the significance of the trials. Imagine how dull and forgettable they would have seemed if all that happened was a gate raised and Link could now enter the tower. It helps that the gameplay is exciting and fun, but the cinematics and drama of Ganon's Castle is what I most remember it for, and why I've decided to place it above some of the more traditional dungeons in the game. Off the heels of discussing the incredibly theatrical Ganon's Castle, we have another dungeon that benefits greatly for aspects not necessarily related to gameplay. As I've discussed repeatedly throughout this ranking thus far, atmosphere is a large part of what makes these Ocarina of Time dungeons so critically acclaimed, and for the Shadow Temple that couldn't be any more true. A lot of what makes the Shadow Temple the thrilling experience that it is how creepy, dark, and terrifying the dungeon is. It relies heavily on its theme to disorient the player and obscure the path forward, making heavy use of illusions and other distractions to catch the player off guard. In fact, the greatest achievement of the Shadow Temple is its ability to legitimately scare the player on a consistent basis as they make their way through the dungeon. Impressively, and as a credit to the Shadow Temple's frightening nature, several rooms come to mind when I think of well-done scares in this dungeon. The first is a hallway with 3 Skulltulas before the main room that always seems to catch me off guard, as even with the knowledge that they are there, I will sometimes still slide unexpectedly into them because of the low traction of the hover boots. Another room is towards the end of the dungeon where the boss key is found, where 2 walls of wooden spikes slowly close in on Link. The first time I entered this room, I did not think to use Din's Fire, and let me tell you, the panic really starts to set in as those spikes inch closer and closer. And another room where you are to push a stone block underneath spikes always gives me anxiety and makes me jump if I ever happen to get hit by them. This is all on top of countless creepy monsters that occupy the dark corners of this temple. The disgusting dead hand from the bottom of the well makes another appearance here, rewarding you with the hover boots after defeat this time. There are rooms with Gibdos in them that, much like the Redeads, will scream and freeze Link in his tracks before lunging onto him and sucking his life out. Many rooms provide the discomfort of knowing that if Link stands still for too long, a Wallmaster will descend from above, bringing him back to the start of the temple. And the undead Stalfos are also prone to popping out of thin air to ambush Link when he least expects it. If you're a fan of horror and things that make you uncomfortable, you'll feel right at home with the numerous floating skulls and self-activated guillotines. If, on the other hand, you're a fan of traditional Zelda dungeons that test your spatial awareness, the Shadow Temple may make you uncomfortable in another way. Despite all the smoke and mirrors in the Shadow Temple, most of the time the path of progression is as clear as day, leading to the most linear dungeon in Ocarina of Time. The problem is that so many things are hidden in this dungeon that you will likely use the Lens of Truth the entire time you're in the Shadow Temple, somewhat defeating the purpose of making things hidden in the first place. I'm not sure if it was intentional to design something so simple and straightforward after the brutal water temple that precedes it, but it makes for a very casual dungeon experience, which is a bit of a letdown so deep into the game. I also think that the Shadow Temple could have benefited from either having a direct connection to the bottom of the well, or its own independent child section similar to the Spirit Temple, which we'll talk about later. For as scary and intimidating as the Shadow Temple can be at times, it is somewhat softened by the fact that you're adult Link, the hero of time, the man that just conquered 3 temples infested with numerous traps and ferocious enemies. There's a vulnerability and innocence that comes from playing as child Link that I felt during the bottom of the well that didn't really get replicated in the Shadow Temple. That's not to take away from what the Shadow Temple has accomplished, but more of me saying that there was a lost opportunity to double down even further on the terrifying themes that make the Shadow Temple so beloved to begin with. In the end, I still consider the Shadow Temple to be a shining example of why Ocarina of Time's legacy is what it is, and a memorable area that shows that there's more to being a great dungeon than just puzzle solving. Perhaps it is just my experience, but whenever I think of Ocarina of Time, the Forest Temple is the first image I usually see in my head. Something about this temple's beautifully bizarre theme and aesthetic has imprinted fond memories into my mind that to this day make me smile when I think about them. Whether it's the riveting face-off with the temple's boss Phantom Ganon, or scrambling to solve the Green Pose puzzle before time runs out, the Forest Temple has so many memorable moments that really capture what make Ocarina of Time a classic. Unfortunately, for as many good memories as I've had with this dungeon over the years, my good feelings for the first adult temple have somewhat withered away over time. First, I have to address the notoriously annoying key that is located at the top of the first room of the dungeon. For most players, they will miss this key at the start of the Forest Temple, inevitably blocking their progress later on. It will usually lead to a ton of backtracking and a feeling like you're going crazy as you search for the seemingly fabled missing key. Initially, I used to view the key as the problem itself, but upon further analysis, I feel the issue is actually the red Poe that you defeat after acquiring the bow. This mini-boss drops a small key allowing you to progress through the locked door at the top of the Blue Pose staircase, and what generally happens here, if you haven't collected the key at the dungeon's start, is that you will almost immediately come upon another locked door. Considering the key from the Red Po, in theory, would unlock the last sealed door anyway, I question why they didn't reverse the Po rooms and lock off the red one. In this scenario, after collecting the bow and receiving the compass after defeating the Blue Po, the player would be blocked from progression but with an incentive to check their map to look for any secrets they missed. Through this process, the player would eventually notice there is a chest somewhere towards the start that they missed, and through some exploration would find it atop the tree. They could then make their way back, fight the Red Po, and get the key to unlock the door in the following hallway. This way, if the last significant item found is the compass, it makes sense design-wise to hide something so sneakily at the beginning, as there will be a moment where the player would be prompted to check their map. And in the event that the player explored on their own, they would be rewarded with a small key early and avoid having to do any backtracking later on. In my eyes, it would fix the most complained about aspect of the Forest Temple, while allowing a key I do think is cleverly placed to exist as something players feel rewarded for finding instead of relieved. Though this would expose the dungeon for being as linear as it is, as we discussed with the Shadow Temple, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. What is bad, however, is the disappointing nature of the dungeon's Po hunt. While the concept is something I want to like, in the long run the boring battles against the Poes become too much for me to enjoy. Even by the time they try to mix things up with the final purple Po, my patience has run thin with all the waiting I've had to do. Combat should be exciting, and whether it's one of the first 3 standard Po fights or the final special one, excitement is hard to come by as you basically stand around each time. Much like the Shadow Temple, the Forest Temple excels by creating a mood of uneasiness and uncertainty through its dark tones, perplexing visuals, and labyrinth-like structure. This is constantly reinforced by the hauntingly unsettling music that plays in the background, giving the entire temple a mysteriously restless feel. The Forest Temple is remembered not for its design or key placement, but its legions of creepy enemies and iconic scenery. From the opening encounter with the Stalfos to getting trapped into the dungeon boss fight, the Forest Temple lays the groundwork for what a trial worthy of adult Link should look like. It's why, despite all its flaws, it still holds a place in my heart for captivating me both as a child and as an adult. For all the excellent qualities the Fire Temple possesses, the most important to its legacy is its ability to incorporate story elements from outside the dungeon. The inclusion of the many captured Gorons, along with an emotionally powerful cutscene with Darunia towards the beginning of the dungeon, is what allows the Fire Temple to stand out from every other trial in the game. It adds stakes to the temple that no other dungeon is able to match, as you're fighting not just to awaken the Sage and gain the Fire Medallion, but to save the entire Goron race from the brink of extinction. In this way, from a storytelling perspective, the Fire Temple is the most complete dungeon in Ocarina of Time with the most impact on the land of Hyrule. As a result, it is one of the few dungeons to have an emotional payoff that exceeds simply getting the next seal needed to lock Ganondorf and his evil away. This is particularly noteworthy because I think they do such a good job of motivating you to conquer such a dangerous temple through your relationship with Darunia. When you first encounter the Goron Patriarch as a child, you are scoffed at as the leader of the Gorons is insulted that the royal family would disrespect him by sending a kid to deal with his plea for help. After cheering him up with Saria's song and winning some good favor, Link then proves himself to Darunia by eliminating King Dodongo and granting the Gorons access to their food supply once again. Afterwards, being impressed by Link's courage, Darunia swears him in as his brother, accepting him as one of their own. Later on, after Ganondorf revives an ancient Goron-eating monster, Link comes face to face with Darunia again where he asks you, as his sworn brother, to help save his people and protect them from Ganondorf's evil creature. Then, showing the courage Link did when he risked his life to save Dodongo's cavern, Darunia enters the boss room door without the legendary Hammer of Goron lore to try and save his people and buy Link some time. It's a perfect example of Ocarina of Time's brilliant yet subtle storytelling at work. When you obtain the Goron Ruby as a child, you likely don't think much of the Gorons or Darunia as you move on to find the next spiritual stone. The game even plays up your lack of understanding of Darunia's words when receiving the Shining Stone. However, the seeds of your friendship have been planted, and when the camera zooms in on the Goron Patriarch in the Fire Temple, you can't help but take on the responsibility of helping a friend in need. It adds an unprecedented level of personal stake to an already important dungeon, making it all the more rewarding as you release Darunia's captured brethren one by one. And that's not even mentioning the fact that this man also named his son after you because the impact you made on his life was so great. The Fire Temple thankfully also has one of the best designs in the game, with many memorable rooms that highlight its uniqueness. Whether it's the inclusion of flare dancers as the mini-bosses, or the temple's clever use of fire as a method of transportation, Link's second adult dungeon has a lot of memorable moments. One of my favorite sections is right after obtaining the Megaton Hammer, where Link smashes a block that descends into the room you met Darunia in earlier, bridging the gap to where the boss door sits and vertically connecting the dungeon. Another standout room is towards the middle of the dungeon where, after you make a leap onto a grate hovering above some lava, a wall of fire slowly gains on you as you make your way to the other side of the room, creating a tense environment. Even the fire maze, for as frustrating as it can be to choose the wrong path, jumps out as a memorable puzzle that does a great job of incorporating its temple's theme. And while Volvagia may not be the most difficult fight, boiling down to a giant game of whack-a-mole, it is one of the coolest and most cinematic in Ocarina of Time. Watching this massive Goron Eater chase you down with its fire breath is the type of experience I live for in Zelda, and it's complemented by one of the most intimidating boss chambers in the game. With no Darunia in sight, you can only make the logical conclusion that this monster probably got the better of him, making Volvagia among the most satisfying bosses to defeat in any Zelda game because of the revenge you get for your brother. And this is all capped off with the best and most rewarding sage conversation as Darunia thanks Link, acknowledges him as a man, and gives him a symbol of his eternal friendship. It's truly an underrated dungeon that I appreciate more and more each time I play it, and it's why I rank it as Ocarina of Time's second best dungeon. You might suspect, given that the title of this Zelda game is Ocarina of Time, that time would play a larger role in the dungeons of the game. While time plays a significant factor to the story and some gameplay elements, only one of the main dungeons in the game actually takes advantage of Link's ability to go back and forth between child and adult forms. We approach something close to that concept with the Bottom of the Well and the Shadow Temple, but ultimately they remain exclusive to their respective forms. It, in my opinion, is one of the great missed opportunities of Ocarina of Time, as it would have been an ingenious way to connect the two worlds of Hyrule even further. However, as I mentioned before, one dungeon did take advantage of the time-traveling feature, and it's a large part of why the Spirit Temple is my favorite dungeon in Ocarina of Time. Even though I still feel more could have been done with the concept, I very much appreciate that the Spirit Temple is the only dungeon you play as both child and adult Link. The concept of having to go in first as a child to obtain the Silver Gauntlets, only to come back as an adult and use those gauntlets to progress where you couldn't otherwise, is just such a novel idea to me. My only complaint is that I wanted to see more of those types of puzzles, but perhaps due to it being too slow to switch between forms, that's all we really got to see of the concept. Still, both child and adult sections are fun to play, and each half of the dungeon is as memorable as the other. For the child side of things, you get to meet Nabooru for the first time and engage in a little dialogue before the dungeon starts. It remains one of the only times in the game where you get an option between dialogue choices, and has always stood out to me because of that. You also have a few puzzles that revolve around activating sun switches, which I think is a neat way to foreshadow the upcoming Mirror Shield puzzles you'll find on the adult side. This is also the first point in the game where you encounter an Iron Knuckle, which is far and away the most powerful mini-boss in the game. While not Dark Link levels of difficulty, the Iron Knuckle is a challenge for those not familiar with how to fight it, and a terrific boss to end Child Link's half of the Spirit Temple. On the adult side of things, we have some of the most complex puzzles in the entire game. Immediately, the puzzle where Link must bait a statue to step on a switch for him to unlock a nearby door comes to mind, as it is one of the most creative puzzles in Ocarina of Time, as well as one of the most tricky. Another is one after obtaining the boss key, where you use the help of several mirrors to reflect light onto the face of a statue, causing it to crumble away and expose the boss door. And my personal favorite is a puzzle where several floating mummies move in a specific way in relation to Link, and you have to kill them off by moving to certain locations in the room, forcing them each into an open flame. These puzzles help contribute to what I consider to be the most balanced difficulty of any dungeon in Ocarina of Time, as it feels appropriately challenging for the second to last trial in the game. Of course, we still have to talk about the fantastic double boss fight that's unique to the Spirit Temple as well. First, we must defeat yet another Iron Knuckle, our third for this dungeon thus far, before it is quickly revealed to be a brainwashed Nabooru. After she attempts to escape, the evil Hag twins capture her again before retreating to the boss chamber where we engage in our second two-phase fight in the game. Phase 1 involves reflecting one sister's magic towards the other to deal damage, before moving to Phase 2 where Twin Rova is born. This fused creature is defeated in a similar fashion, however players must now just absorb 3 attacks of either fire or ice before reflecting a powerful blast back at the witch. It is a unique and challenging fight that feels more engaging and involved than any other fight in the entire game. In truth, I have very little criticisms for the Spirit Temple and really believe it is a perfect example of how to do a Zelda dungeon right. It's complex without being overwhelming. It has a variety of puzzles and enemies, with several new gameplay elements introduced here as well. The music is eerie and mysterious, giving it the feeling of a true final test of your skills. The boss is fun and memorable, and even little details like the pots attacking you upon entry help make the Spirit Temple the iconic dungeon that it is. As I said before, it's my favorite dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and one of the best in all of Zelda, and deserving of the top spot on my list. While the dungeons in Ocarina of Time are not without flaws, they remain as excellent examples of what a Zelda dungeon can be. Their impact cannot be understated, not just for being the first 3D Zelda dungeons, but because they are still being discussed nearly 25 years later. Through their atmosphere, music, and puzzles, they create an experience that intrigues and mystifies in the most pleasant of ways, and deserve recognition for their achievements. And regardless of what Zelda games came before it, or will come after it, there will likely never be a more universally praised game than Ocarina of Time, and it has its unforgettable dungeons to thank for that.